Welcome back to our Advent Prayer Workshop. This is Father Mark Toops, welcoming you back to our conversation about how this Advent can be one of the most personal and transformational that you've ever had. Now, I said that this is our second video. If you did not yet watch our first video, which introduces the importance of us preparing for a person, not just for a day, I actually want to encourage you out of love to actually stop. Go watch that first video and then join us again for this conversation, because the invitation of how we can prepare for a person rather than a day will make a lot more sense if you watch that first video. But if you are with us, obviously the question now that rises in our heart is how? How can we prepare for a person rather than just in a day? Well, that is prayer. And hopefully as you find yourself hungry to learn more about prayer, the question that naturally rises up in so many of our hearts is how. I think a lot of us have a desire for prayer. I think a lot of us have a desire to encounter God. And maybe this is the year that you actually carve out some time. But if your life is anything like mine, I can leave prayer a little frustrated, not because I didn't have the desire for God, but I just didn't know how. I didn't know what to do. And if that's where you are, I want to welcome you and I want to encourage you through the lens of St. Ignatius of Loyola, one of the spiritual giants of the church. He is actually inviting us to encounter God in prayer through a style of prayer that's called imaginative prayer. For those of us who might be a little resident to trust our imagination, let me meet you where you are and let me invite you to look at the word imagination through the eyes of the church. Sometimes we need to reclaim words that have been taken by the secular culture and watered down. But if we can meet them in their original context, actually it offers us hope and it gives us some direction in our spiritual life. The word imagination simply refers to our spiritual senses, right? So we all know that we can hear, right? Physically, we can see physically, we can feel physically. We have our physical exterior senses. Well, as there is a unity between the body and the soul, not only do our bodies have senses, but our souls have senses, right? So interiorly, with our hearts, with our spirits, we can hear God, we can see God, we can feel God with our spiritual senses. And when our spiritual senses are connected to reality, we call that imagination. Now, when our spiritual senses are not connected to reality, that's what we call fantasy. That's not what we're talking about. We're not inviting you into something that's not connected to reality. We're actually teaching you how you can use your spiritual senses to encounter God who gave us those spiritual senses. And that technique of prayer is called imaginative prayer. Simply put, Ignatius of Loyola in the spiritual exercises would invite you to have a scripture passage in front of you, to get familiar with that scripture passage, and then knowing that the scriptures are alive and active, right? That's what St. Paul says. They're designed to help us encounter God. You and I would, in our imagination, now enter the scene. So instead of watching, for example, Christ be born into the world, imagine if you were taught how to actually be there. Imagine what it would be like in order for you to actually see Mary, to see Joseph, to be there at the birth, to actually hold Jesus in your arms. Imagine if you were taught how to pray in that regard. That's what St. Ignatius is inviting you to. And that's what we can help you with if you want to prepare for the person of Jesus Christ this year. Now, in our third video, in our third conversation in this Advent Prayer Workshop, we're going to actually walk you through some examples of how to make that happen. But I want to lay another foundation with you today to help us in, you might say, laying a foundation for relating to God. One of my favorite priests out there is Monsignor John Sipple, and he often says that prayer is not a swing, it's a seesaw. In other words, if you just think back to your childhood when you were swinging and seesawing, it only takes one person to swing. At minimum, one person get on a swing. The energy is driven by the person. The experience is received by one person. It's very different for a seesaw. It takes two people to seesaw, right? There's another person that's engaged in that experience. Prayer is never a swing. Prayer is always the seesaw. There's always another person that is involved in the experience of prayer. In fact, the Catechism says that prayer is responding to a God who's already there. In imaginative prayer, not only are we entering into the scene, but we are engaging with the person of Jesus Christ that is there in the scene. It's the seesaw, right? We are in a relationship with God. Now, I want to teach you a little acronym right now, ARRR. That's just a fancy acronym for acknowledge, relate, receive, and respond. One of the things that can help you as you pray, especially with your imagination, is to acknowledge what is happening in your heart as you enter into the scripture passage. Just acknowledging what are the thoughts, the feelings, or the desires as we're there. We don't want to just now acknowledge that or think about that, right? We want to relate that to the person of Jesus Christ. We want to not just think about that or ruminate that. We want to relate that to God. Then we want to receive back from God all that he wants to share with us. And imagine if we could teach you how to do that. Imagine if we could teach you how to hear God's voice or to know what it is that God is saying back to you. And then finally, we want to respond with a triumphant yes to God or to whatever it is that he's asking for us, right? To acknowledge, relate, receive, and respond. Those four dynamics are a part of imaginative prayer. If this Advent is going to be a time where we experience a person and not just a day, we want to know how to prepare. And that's what imaginative prayer and relating to God through acknowledge, relate, receive, and respond can do to help you. Now, in our third part of this series, this Advent prayer workshop, we're going to give you an example of an imaginative prayer and talk about those resources that can help you out along the way. But I hope that this conversation has been helpful. It's been a joy to be with you. Looking forward to that last part of the Advent prayer workshop. And until that conversation unfolds, God bless you.